An elderly millionaire, Richard Langston, had everything: wealth, power, and influence. But there was one thing he despised: his wheelchair-bound daughter, Amelia. To him, she was a burden, a flaw in his perfect life. One cold night, without remorse, he abandoned her on a deserted road, leaving her to die. Alone and helpless, Amelia refused to give up, crawling through the darkness until fate intervened. Years later, the tables turned. Richard found himself facing ruin, and the very daughter he discarded held his fate in her hands. Would she show him mercy, or would karma finally make him pay? The answer would leave him shattered in ways he never imagined. An elderly millionaire, burdened by greed and selfishness, made a heartless decision. One fateful night, he abandoned his wheelchair-bound daughter on a deserted road, leaving her to die. To him, she was nothing more than an inconvenience, a burden that stood in the way of his lavish life. But fate had other plans. Years later, as he basked in the wealth he had chosen over his own flesh and blood, karma came knocking in the most unexpected way. The night he left her was bitterly cold. His daughter, Amelia, had been born with a rare neurological disorder that left her paralyzed from the waist down. Despite her condition, she was intelligent, kind-hearted, and full of life. But to her father, Richard Langston, she was a symbol of weakness, a blemish on his otherwise perfect, wealthy existence. He had built an empire from the ground up, amassing millions in real estate and investments. Everything in his life had been carefully curated, except for the daughter he never wanted. After his wife died in an accident, Richard's patience with Amelia wore thin. The once distant father became cruel, treating her like a prisoner in their lavish mansion. While she longed for his love, all she received was disdain. He refused to acknowledge her as his heir, convinced that a disabled daughter was unworthy of carrying on his legacy. His cold, calculating mind saw only one solution. He needed to rid himself of Amelia once and for all. One evening, he drove her to an abandoned stretch of road in the middle of nowhere. The darkness of the night mirrored the darkness in his heart as he wheeled her out of the car. Amelia, confused and frightened, begged him to explain what was happening. "You're strong, Amelia," he said with mock sympathy. "If you were meant to survive, you will. If not, well, I guess that's life." With that, he turned, got into his car, and drove away, leaving his own daughter stranded in the freezing night, miles away from civilization. Amelia sat there helpless, fear gripping her chest. She screamed for help, but there was no one around. Her body trembled as the wind howled, and for the first time in her life, she understood what true abandonment felt like. But she refused to die. Summoning every ounce of strength, she dragged herself off the road and into the woods, using only her arms to move forward. The pain was unbearable, but her will to live was stronger. Hours passed before headlights appeared in the distance. A kind-hearted truck driver named Jake happened to be passing through when he spotted Amelia's frail body near the roadside. Without hesitation, he scooped her up and rushed her to a hospital. For weeks, Amelia fought for her life. The exposure had weakened her, but her spirit remained unbroken. Jake visited her every day, becoming the father figure she never had. He listened to her story with tears in his eyes and made a vow that she would never be alone again. Over the years, Amelia rebuilt her life. With Jake's encouragement, she pursued her education, studying law and advocating for the rights of disabled individuals. She became a renowned lawyer, using her intelligence and resilience to fight for those who had been cast aside just as she once was. The world came to know her as a fierce advocate for justice. Meanwhile, Richard Langston continued to grow richer but lonelier. His wealth had consumed him, and his health began to deteriorate. His business partners turned on him, his so-called friends abandoned him, and he found himself battling illness with no one by his side. Regret clawed at his soul, but it was too late. One fateful day, he found himself in a courtroom, sued for fraudulent dealings in his company. His empire was crumbling, and the person leading the case against him? None other than Amelia Langston. Richard's breath caught in his throat as he locked eyes with the daughter he had left to die. She was no longer the helpless girl he had abandoned. She was strong, powerful, and the very force that would destroy him. Amelia's voice was steady as she addressed the court. Richard Langston is a man without conscience. He has spent his life exploiting others, discarding those he deems unworthy. But today, justice will be served. Richard trembled in his seat, realizing that the daughter he had thrown away had become the very person who would bring him to his knees. As Richard walked out of the courthouse, the weight of his downfall pressed down on him, crushing his spirit. His once impeccable suit now seemed like a distant memory of the man he used to be, full of power, arrogance, and control. The sharp lines of his face had softened, the years of greed and selfishness etched into his skin like a map of his poor decisions. The crowds parted as he moved through them, some whispering in disbelief, others simply ignoring him. But his eyes were fixed ahead, to the only person who mattered in that moment, Amelia. She stood just a few feet away, her back straight, her expression calm and collected. It was almost surreal to Richard. This was the daughter he had abandoned, the one he thought he'd rid himself of forever. Yet here she was, standing tall, confident, and in control. The years had not broken her, as he had hoped. If anything, they had forged her into a force that was unstoppable. Richard's heart began to pound in his chest. Amelia's presence felt like a reminder of everything he had lost, and for the first time, a flicker of guilt stirred deep within him. But he had no words to offer. He had left her to die on that desolate road, and no apology could undo the damage he had caused. Amelia met his gaze, her eyes calm yet piercing. She had every right to hate him, to seek vengeance for the unimaginable cruelty he had shown her. But instead, there was only a quiet understanding in her eyes. She had long forgiven him, not for his sake, but for hers. Amelia knew that holding on to resentment would only weigh her down. She had spent too many years rebuilding her life, creating something meaningful out of the brokenness he had left behind. "You look like a man who's lost everything," Amelia said, her voice steady, not a hint of malice in her tone. "But what's more tragic, Richard, is that you never had anything to begin with." Richard flinched at her words, his chest tightening. He couldn't argue with her. All his wealth, all his power, had amounted to nothing in the end. He had sacrificed his family, his humanity, and his soul in pursuit of riches that meant nothing in the face of true loss. Amelia took a step forward, her wheelchair silent against the pavement. The wind caught her hair as she stood before him, unwavering. "I gave you every chance to be a father, Richard," she continued, her voice gentle but firm. "I don't need your approval. I don't need anything from you anymore. I've built a life, one that I can be proud of. But you lost your chance to be the man you could have been.